Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
Good morning, afternoon, or evening at whatever time you are watching or listening to us. This is, in fact, Peter Robbins, and the show is Meanwhile Here on Earth, broadcast via our central station in Arkansas. Our producer, Race Hobbs, there, and the network, KUNX Digital Broadcasting in Missouri. I am just outside of Ithaca, New York, where it is very cold tonight, but we're going to warm things up very quickly. Have two guests tonight, one of whom I've invited to be a co-host, an old friend and close colleague. Our guest is Jamison Bollinger. He is a proud veteran of the United States military from a family whose members have seen service to their country going back to the American Revolution. He is an honor graduate of North Carolina State University and was a police officer for more than 10 years, including experience as a criminal investigator. He is 48 years old and has been a firefighter for about 4 years now in his home state of North Carolina. He is the husband of an amazing and beautiful wife, father of 5, and grandfather of 5. Jamie first began having troubling, abnormal, and unexplained experiences in childhood. His first UFO encounter was with a classic triangle-shaped craft when he was in high school in the early 1990s. Other such experiences have extended into adulthood. Bob Long is a researcher in the field of alien abduction. Starting as an independent researcher back in the 1980s, he decided to join the ranks of the Mutual UFO Network, aka MUFON, in the 90s, as well as the Intruders Foundation under the leadership of the late Bud Hopkins. He served as the liaison from Intruders Foundation to MUFON for many years. Bob was also the Assistant State Director of New York State MUFON for a decade. His relationship with MUFON culminated in his being chosen as the Master of Ceremonies for the 2002 International MUFON Symposium in Rochester, New York, and actually a very significant one for a lot of us. Since then, he has co-authored a book titled Alien Abduction: The Control Factor. It was released in 2020 and co-written with Jim Bauk. Jamie Bollinger, Bob Long, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth, my friends.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's an honor.
It's my pleasure. Well, I accept that as a compliment. It's one of those shows for me that is particularly special in that we're not dealing with some huge major case or have some super famous researcher or author on. We have two really extraordinary men living their lives in a way that I have nothing but respect for. The three of us from considerably different backgrounds. And both Bob and I met in 1997. We live in New York State, not that far a drive from each other. Been through quite a bit together, friends and colleagues. And one of the best things, as a lot of you know about the social network, there's so much nonsense and crap, and the internet is such a double-edged sword. But at its best, you occasionally meet people who go on to become friendly acquaintances, and then internet friends, and then real friends. And for Bob and I, that's what's happened with Jamie. Um, we've yet to actually meet in person. I expect that's in the cards. But I wanted to begin, Jamie, as I begin with a lot of guests, which is at the beginning.
Okay.
You are a native of North Carolina.
Yes, that's correct. Born and raised.
And can you tell us a bit about your parents and about your childhood?
Sure. My parents were your all-American couple, met in high school, got married, and I have an older sister. She's 12 years older than I. And then I came along and changed up everything. I grew up at the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains here in western North Carolina, and had a good childhood up until I left home and then got married. But it was very abnormal, and I could never felt I could never tell anyone about it. But other than that, it was a good childhood.
Um, what did your dad do for a living?
My dad, he's been a truck driver for many years. He was in the military, of course, for years, and then when he got out of the military, he became a truck driver, and he's still doing that at 82 years old. He is still driving a tractor trailer. In fact, he made the cover of North Carolina Logger magazine or something like that. I just received the edition the other day. This picture right on the cover.
Wow.
And my mom was a quality control specialist with in the shoe industry. They had government contracts that made boots for the United States military, and that's what she did. And she did some sewing as well. She kind of dabbled in a lot of that stuff there, and she passed away in 2008.
One of the things, I don't know, when you meet a new friend and you start to learn about them and they about you, the things that you have in common become as pronounced as the things that are completely different in terms of your childhood and your experiences. My dad served in World War II. He was in the Army Air Corps. Very proud of his service, as we were proud of him. But for Russian Jewish immigrants, or in my dad's case, his mom's parents came over probably before the Civil War, which is ancient for Jewish Americans. My mother's family came over around the time of the First World War, and it's difficult to trace family lineage too far back because records were not carefully kept. Jewish people were not invited to join the Tsar's army as a rule. And for me, learning that in your family, the men have served in the military going back to the American Revolution.
That's correct.
Were you brought up like just with that sort of as background information, or actively learning about this, through stories that you learned from your parents or your grandparents?
Most of it I learned after the fact. My dad was he's a Vietnam veteran, and I learned of his experiences, of course, way later on. So, but I've learned through pictures and through just having conversations with my parents, and they divorced when I was a year old, so I was kind of going back and forth a little bit. But I learned most of it through talking to my dad, and then my mom telling me how different my dad was during that time. Apparently, it was pretty rocky for a lot of that period. So I came about some of the information by accident as well. So just talking to people who I find out they know my dad, and just kind of gathered all my information that way.
And you now live with your wife pretty much in the same area that you grew up in, or a different part of North Carolina?
I'm in the exact same area. I moved back here in 2016, and went to work for the sheriff's office in the detention facility. I did not want to return back to the road. I'm sure we can all watch TV and understand why. I just decided after over a decade in law enforcement, I did not want to return to that.
Yeah.
So, and then from there, I moved on to the state prison. They closed that county detention facility to open a new one, but I chose to pursue a career at the state facility. And so I've been back here since 2016, and it's good to be back home.
I'm going to now backtrack a bit and pick up with Bob, and then come back to where we are right now. Bob, you live very much in the same area where you were born. Am I correct?
I was born.
You are in the same house you were born in.
Yes, an old farmhouse built in the 1840s.
Wow. Can you tell us a bit about your childhood and your parents?
Well, my parents split up when I was very young. I didn't see my dad past the age of 3. But growing up here, it's in the country, and I was very fortunate to be given a long leash. I spent most of my childhood in the woods, in the creeks and like that, catching frogs and hunting and really enjoying nature at its best. That was the majority of my childhood. I occasionally looked up at the sky, wondered about the stars and like that. And, every once in a while I'd see something that I didn't understand. But, we all know how that goes.
Jamie, was your childhood made up in part of those kind of activities as well?
Indeed, they were. I spent a lot of time outside, and my mom would have to yell to figure out where I was. I would yell back so she would know the general direction I was in, and she would have to get a little nasty sometimes to get me out of the woods or out of a backyard or field, wherever I was. And I as well spent some time, quite a bit of time, looking at the stars with this feeling of longing that I never understood.
Yeah.
That's something that from as early as I can remember, like a longing when I would look up and see that.
I was born in New York City in Queens County and lived there for my first 7 years. My mom's parents lived in Queens. My dad's parents lived in Manhattan. And between them, it was a wonderful introduction before I really got myself into the world of nature to the world of culture. My dad's parents would take me to the museums and the theater. My grandfather would walk me around Lower Manhattan and tell me stories of what it was like when he was a kid, as well as give me a sense of that history was a living thing and that buildings, architecture was very reflective of that. At the age of 7, our folks, my sister Helen was born already, kind of took a deep breath and followed that part of the American dream and moved us out of the city about 30 miles east of Manhattan to what I now realize was an idyllic little village that a block away, there was a state park. And very quickly I acquired the permission that I needed from my folks by displaying some sense of responsibility that I could disappear, on a non-school day, often to the park for the day. You think now, of course, for most parents, this is not the way that they run things. How lucky the three of us were. For me, again, starting at about 7 or 8, as opposed to from early childhood, that introduction to the wider world of squirrels and birds and chipmunks and different kinds of insects and every kind of plant life imaginable and the wonderful world of bugs was incredibly liberating. And again, being 30 miles away from New York City, I kind of grew up with that some sense of balance, which I'm so thankful for. For me, the world of UFOs, possibilities of life on other planets, it just really didn't register, except once I was old enough to go to the movies. And that's another thing I'm very thankful to my mom about. She also gave me a very long leash, and any movie I wanted to see on a Saturday afternoon, pretty much I could go see. And reviewing some of those movies in my mind, it kind of amazes me still that I had that great fun of seeing films that I'm sure folks wouldn't, nothing incredibly inappropriate, but just not made for little kids. Although the wonderful world of monsters and the ones from space and things that blew up and spaceships and B movies, the best. But it wasn't until, as you guys know, I had my life-changing sighting with my sister at the age of 14, blanked it out. And Helen, of course, having her abduction experience. For me, it was 14 years. I was in my late 20s before that memory surfaced. Jamie, when you talk about that feeling, well, not even wistfulness, but that feeling that you had when you contemplated the stars and what it was all about out there. And do you remember consciously the first memories of something happening or seeing something that made you aware that there was a whole nother aspect to life, and it didn't necessarily involve human beings or animals or plants here on Earth?
Yeah, I can say about that time is when I would have these, I don't really know what to call these episodes. They were at nighttime, and this is going to sound very cliche, but it was after everyone had gone to bed, but I was always awake, lying in bed, and I can only think that maybe that's because that's when we're the most vulnerable. But something would come over me like something was trying to take me somewhere. I would hear a swooshing sound. I really don't know how to describe it other than if you take a pool noodle or something and you twirl it overhead, that swooshing sound you would get. I would hear that in my ears. There would be a sensation of like a magnet or a force trying to pull me up, like it was wanting to take me somewhere, and I didn't want to go. I couldn't open my eyes. I would cry. I would fight against it and fight against it. And just, it was a battle. And then after a period of time, that would be it. And I would wake up the next morning not knowing what happened. But that was an ongoing occurrence for me. That was the very earliest, 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, around in there. And it happened a lot.
Bob, you, as you became involved in the world of UFO studies, you were not and are not a generalist. you moved into the specialty area of UFO abduction and contact between us human beings and non-human beings. I'm sure some of this resonates for you as part of a profile. And again, I invite you at any point to step in and ask questions or follow-up questions, what Jamie's saying. Jamie, did you ever feel that you could talk to anybody about these feelings, about these sensations, about your concerns?
No.
Yeah.
And I left out a very important detail. I would hear was like a voice in my head. It was like a deafening whisper. If that I know that's oxymoronic. It's very hard to describe, but this voice was like trying to talk to me, but it would sound like my sister. And I'm like, why does this voice, sound like my sister? But looking back, we were very close. So I can only wonder, were they maybe using that as a way to put me at ease? And that was, yeah.
I think that's a very fair deduction, and not at all unfamiliar to Bob and I as far as accounts that we've heard over the years. And doesn't it make all the sense in the world? I want to say here, we have listeners and viewers that have been with this show for years or follow the subject of the greater picture of UFOs, now often referred to as UAPs, abduction in particular, who a good number, I expect, have had similar experiences as well. And especially for guys, especially for the world of men, we're either brought up with the message, either overtly or covertly, that you got to stand tough. Boys don't cry. If you're scared, don't show it, because that's a sign of weakness, and guys have to, all that stuff. I feel very fortunate that my primary male role models, my dad, my granddads, my uncles, none of them were hard guys. They were strong. Some of them were smart, but they were all good men who, didn't push the kids into, you got to be a football hero, that kind of thing. But even if you have that background, still, it's something that boys, they look out at the world of role models, and you got a gripe like that, fear is for sissies on a certain level. And yeah, did you find a way to kind of deal with this, or just, it became, to use a book title of Dr. David Jacobs, one of the best known pioneer abduction researchers, that this was like the center of your secret life, so to say, and you developed other things to not have to find somebody to talk to about this, for lack of a more descriptive phrase?
No, I can remember it being quite the opposite. I would dread going to bed at night. What actually ended up happening was, I lived with my mom. My parents were divorced. It got to where I would dread this so bad, I would go to my mom's room, try to go to sleep in there. And for a period of time, she let me do that. But apparently I moved around a lot in my sleep, so she would make me go back to my room. And I was very resistant to do that. I don't remember really being able to cope with it very well. And I've not even told my sister to this very day about this. She's going to find out now, but I think it's time that she finds out.
Yeah.
I didn't really develop coping mechanisms until a little later on.
If I can ask a question, Jamie,
Sure.
when you're having these occurrences, you said you kept your eyes shut. Was it because didn't want to open your eyes, or that you could
Yes,
not?
I was terrified to open my eyes because when I would hear that, what sounds like a whisper, but it
Mhm.
was like a whisper inside my head, is the only way I can describe it. I was terrified to see what was in front of me. I can remember clenching my eyes closed until it was over, but then I don't remember anything after that. It was always leading up to it, but I could never remember anything after that. This was 2 and 3 times a week.
Pardon?
This was 2, sometimes 3 times a week that this would happen
Wow.
for a period of time. Yeah.
Wow.
You
And
know,
what
yeah,
did
go, please. Your question, Bob.
the experience? At what point did it change from 2 to 3 times a week being scared to what was it turning into from there?
From there, I think there was a period where maybe nothing happened. I don't recall anything happening. It wasn't until I was about 13 that I remember my next memory anyway, of being in bed, and my bedroom had been moved to a different end of the house at this point. And I would lay in there at night and listen to music. And one night I was laying there awake, and this big spotlight came over the house. Well, I could see it coming first of all, and then it came over the house, and I'm like, "What the heck is this?" It didn't sound like a helicopter or anything, just this really bright light, and it was almost like a hissing or humming sound. It didn't sound like a helicopter. And I remember thinking to myself, this is really odd because it was so bright. It was over top of the house. It sounded strange. At that point in my life, of course, I knew what a helicopter sounded like. It wasn't that. And then once again, that was it. I was up the next morning, and no, I don't recall anything after that. And that was right around the age of 13. And that was the point at which I started looking into the skies at night, and I would have a longing feeling.
Yeah.
I would look at the stars and almost like a homesick feeling. And
You know, I have to say, what you're telling us is it's so familiar to the experiences of so many people that Bob and I have spent time with, chronicling or listening to their histories of these kind of events. Bob, who knew my sister, Helen, they were friends, knows that even though Helen had conscious memories, certainly partial memories of her abduction experience, being taken, being on board, being returned, she didn't mention it to me. And we were very close siblings, particularly so, for more than 14 years. And it wasn't until my prompting her, when I recalled the sighting that led up to her being taken, that she finally talked to me about it. Also, that for me, when I remembered the sighting and reflected on it as this is nothing of ours. These were 5 disc-shaped silvery white objects in a pretty precise V type formation. That what I felt was what I can only describe as kind of a cosmic loneliness. I didn't feel we are all one and I'm part of the universe and everything's together. It was the exact opposite. What I understood as logically as I can now was as a pretty happy kid who had a really, all things considered, a pretty wonderful childhood with great adults, a lot of breaks, no terrible traumas. You know, my granddad died when I was 9 or 10. The dog died. But I was a pretty lucky kid. It was everything that I thought I knew and understood from the adult world was now open to question. And I did not like that at all. In fact, I think that was the trigger that made me, well, certainly a trigger that made me repress that memory so well that it really didn't affect my life for many years until maybe I was ready to deal with it. And it takes courage to do what you're doing right now. Maybe more than most people imagine, because your life, first, to go back a bit, I don't know how you, I'd be curious to know how you think about this, but you come up from a family that one way or the other has, men in your family have been of service to the United States military in times of need, have served their country in combat, you as well. And we're not going into any of those details or even the service branch because it's not germane here, and only things to be proud of. But you're now a firefighter. And before that, you spent 10 years in law enforcement. Your life has been about service to others. It hasn't been about being some successful business guy or acquiring a lot of stuff. It's been about building a family and being of service. Was that something that you were conscious of following that path, so to say, in making your life choices?
Actually, no. No, it just sort of, I've never really thought of it that way, really. I had wanted to be a firefighter since about the age of 4 is its earliest memory. And, life happened and other opportunities presented themselves. But for whatever reason, I've always fallen back into some sort of service type job, something that has a specific discipline to it. And something that's regimented has always felt right for me. But the part about being of service, nothing makes me happy if it's not something is some sort of service. So yeah, it was not really conscious that that's the pattern. It just sort of keeps falling back into that routine.
One of a number of reasons that I wanted Bob on the show with us is the book that he co-authored with Jim Bauk, who's a former state section director of MUFON here in New York State. I've read an awful lot of the UFO literature and a great deal of what's been published on the abduction phenomena, so to say, or contact and people being taken. And Bob and Jim approached the subject in a way I had simply never seen any other researchers or authors do. And we're going to get to some of that in the second half of the show. But the book is about the control factor, so to say. And for people who have a history of these kinds of things happening, whether it's kind of been overt or covert, threading their way through your lives, certain decisions that we make, the full reason that we make them, we're not even clear about. And the fact that as a young person, you had these experiences. And again, this is 25 cents worth of psychology. I may be completely off the mark here, but that from serving a country in the military, you went into law enforcement, which is a pretty overt choice of following a profession that is about control to a degree. At its best, helping to control people who need to be under control for the good of all of us. But in a way, possibly, your decision may, and again, I may be completely off here, but it wouldn't surprise me to learn that there was an element of, that helpless kid who really experienced fear and couldn't open their eyes when these things were happening, maybe wanting some sense of control as an adult that might give you. Does any of that resonate as possible, or am I kind of wandering off into la la land here?
Really, yes, it does. And again, I've never thought of it that way either. You've said something there that really has me thinking now about that, because I was very helpless whenever those occurrences were happening, and my future, an event that happened later on that I'll tell you about whenever we get to that, was the most helpless I had ever felt. I've always, or at least in my adult life, I've always wanted to be in control. I've always wanted to know what's coming, what I'm going to do now, and have a plan, have a contingency plan.
Yeah.
I no longer like surprises, to an extent, but I do have to have an amount of control in every aspect of my life. So that does resonate with me.
It's been my experience that people that share these unusual experiences and quite often have traumatic episodes where they do feel totally out of control tend to gravitate towards professions where they have a higher degree of control, a higher degree of regimentation. Another thing too, you've been let's see, the Coast Guard, right?
Correct.
Yeah. And law enforcement.
Right.
And, people in the military and people in law enforcement are also the same group of people that get to see a lot of these things. Now, may not see them when they're young, but they see them when they're called out because of a report. Yeah. You'll find a lot of law enforcement that, although they may not necessarily talk about it, same way with the military, because there may be a classification attached to it. But right. A lot of them have seen some really strange things. And of course, someone who has experiences of that nature when they're young do tend to want to feel safe, want to feel it. I've seen people that in the wanting to be safe, where they go around and check all the windows and doors at night to make sure they're locked, because they feel like somebody's going to come and get them, even though they may not have any idea what that might mean. I've seen people study martial arts to protect themselves, learn how to shoot to protect themselves, feel that they're always vulnerable. Why do you feel vulnerable? I don't know. I just just a feeling I get sometimes. And a lot of times, over the years I've talked to many people who've had experiences across the board, and it's a pretty common thing to see where people tend to gravitate towards jobs where they're around a lot of people. A lot of people work nights, so they're around people during the nighttime. Mm-hmm. They stay for that way. They sleep with their lights on. They sleep with their doors, windows locked.
Yep.
Bob, what you're saying, it's important that our viewers and listeners understand that you and I are not trying to superimpose some pattern that we believe in because we have some agenda secretly we want to prove to ourselves and others, as opposed to what we're talking about here is based on years of observation and having the privilege of individuals allowing us into some of the most intimate areas of their experience. And we could be talking about a much more conventional series of traumatic events, quiet traumatic or loud traumatic events that help shape us to become the people that we are. In the years that I worked with Bud Hopkins as his assistant, and Bud, of course, the pioneer of the scientific study of this abduction phenomena, its impact on people. What we're talking about here is not uncommon in terms of dynamics, but occasionally, I mean, real life is such a stew of the good, the bad, the happy, the sad, the right, the wrong, all going on often at the exact same moment. Sometimes we have, periods of time that are dominated by things are good or things are not good. And occasionally, even in this area, which is, we're all still trying to wrap our heads around, even the ones who are the best informed or having these experiences, something happens that's funny. And there's no other way to say it. It's just the nature of the beast. For a number of years, Bud worked with a young woman who was from the Midwest who would come in and be parts of our abduction support group meetings, do regressions, but had a lifelong history of these phenomena. And something happened once that absolutely, out of her purveyance, completely cracked us up, because they, they're not perfect. They don't have it completely all mastered, even though they may be a zillion years ahead of us in terms of technology and God knows what else. But during a bedroom visitation, kind of classic pre-abduction event, things that were telepathically communicated to her, and often, as you know, Bob, even the wording is the same. We've seen you before, we'll see you again. You've seen us before, you'll see us again. You're special, we will not harm you. We love you, we will not hurt you. And on this one, she was feeling anxious, and she knew this routine. And they were giving her, well, she was hearing this usual stuff in her head. And at a certain point, I guess to kind of calm her, because she was not as malleable as she had been in past, the voice in her head was, "We're your parents." And she responded, as one does in those situations, as I understand telepathically, with words to the effect of, "No, you are not." Quiet for a moment. The return voice was, "We're your parents' best friends." It's a very unique moment, but it still cracks me up. Out of the darkness comes goofiness occasionally, and that's just the way it is. You said, we were talking about when you were 13 years old or so, Jamie, but something, again, happened later on that had a particular impact on you. Can you tell us a little about that event or incident?
Absolutely. I was in high school, and my bus route, it was a pretty rural route. And it was a long route. I mean, we went through the country and through some fields, not through the field, but the road ran through the field. It was early in the morning. And I remember one morning in particular, there were only 5 students on the bus, including me. I was in high school. The other 4 were asleep. I remember them being asleep because I remember having mischievous thoughts about throwing things like, paper balls at them and things like that.
Can I stop you for one moment and ask you,
Absolutely.
was this in the morning going to school, or was this coming back from school?
This was going to school.
Okay, so it's
yeah.
Okay.
What we actually, that route in the morning time, there were kids who were younger than high school. We would take them to the middle school. That was the other 4 kids that were on the bus. They were going to drop those 4 off, and then they would have gone on around to pick up the rest of the kids my age. I just happened to be the only high schooler on the bus at the time.
Please continue.
Okay. We were on Highway 126, and we were coming through an area that was, it was a right of way. It was fields on either side, and there were power lines and the towers, that have the high tension wires that go across. And I remember seeing a ball of light that it was so bright that it actually looked like it was purple or blue. It's hard to describe. It was the purest light I've ever seen. And I locked in on that, was watching that ball of light. And at one point it came over the power lines, and I couldn't see because of the roof of the bus exactly where that light was coming from. And I could not figure out why I couldn't hear it. There was no sound at all. And my very next memory, I don't know where in this encounter this came into play. I was looking up at a triangle that was, I would say, the size of a football field, but the look of this thing, especially the corners, each of the 3 corners had, they were lights, but they looked like they were cooling off. They were going like from orange to red. You get that particular color change when something's cooling down. That's what the tips of each corner look like. The material of the craft, everything about the way it looked, everything about the encounter at the time was like someone had taken the curtain of reality and ripped it open. And I was absolutely devastated because nothing about that encounter, including that vehicle, whatever it was, looked earthly at all. And I was physically ill. I was so upset at seeing this because it's like I've heard people say, and I think, Peter, I've heard you mention this before. In the past, we go through a checklist very quickly when we see something of what something is or is not.
Yeah.
Just didn't check off anything that I was familiar with. And we didn't have internet. This black triangle phenomenon, I was not aware of it at the time. This was totally unbeknownst to me.
Yeah.
And it took me a while to get over that one. That was when I felt the most vulnerable, the most out of control in my life, was at that moment.
Bob, your thoughts?
Well, one of the things that gives people fear is the level of strangeness of this phenomenon. It is so outside the average everyday paradigm that it blows people's mind. They don't know what to think of it because they've had no experience or education in their life that gives them any information to process what they're seeing at this time. In this particular field, we hear that again and again, where people see things and they're explaining to them about their experience to us. And, I've heard people say, I can't believe this myself. I don't understand this. Or they don't even tell you an aspect of what their experience was because they don't believe it themselves. It was so strange or unusual, and they just couldn't wrap their head around it. Another thing I want to touch on too is people who have been through these experiences. I've met some of the most absolutely outstanding people in my life. Many of the people that I've over the years that I've worked with that had experiences are some of the best people I've ever met. Strong, inquisitive. I've known a couple that are like, yeah, bring it on. I want to find out what this is. I'm going to ask them questions. And, I've seen a lot of humor involved in it too. So, it's like, when Peter was talking about the book that Jim and I wrote, it's all about control and also, regaining some of your control and realizing that the experience, even though it's extremely strange, there are ways that you can personally deal with it.
Listening to you, and I've heard accounts very much like this involving impossible craft, a triangle the size of a battleship. And the rational skeptic in many of us, even listeners, viewers, open-minded, hanging on to, there must be a way to explain my way out of this, that this was, you watched a lot of science fiction when you were a kid. You had a good imagination. You longed to feel special. It was dreamlike. No, is the usual response. It wasn't dreamlike at all. It was the most super real, awake experience of my entire life. There was nothing ambiguous. There was nothing remotely about the imagination informing this. This was just what I said it was. Also, that, and I'm making an educated guess here at this point in your life in high school, that did you have like a best friend, a good buddy that you could share thoughts like this with, or you were completely on your own in perceiving it and knowing there was nowhere to go with this? It wasn't something you could share with a friend and, feel a little more composed because you had somebody in your life that believed you and, you could open up with.
No, I had nowhere to go with it. I grew up in a Christian home to where if things didn't check certain boxes, then they're not real. It had to fall within a certain format of reality, or otherwise it's your imagination. It's easy for me to put that into words now, but that's what I was feeling then. I didn't know where to go. And I think that over time, just through the resilience of that we've been given as human beings, I was able to put it on a shelf and know it was there, never to speak of it again for 20 some years, until I came across the article. I forget the name of the first article, but it wasn't until 20 some years later, I was a police officer and I was reading about the triangle craft that were seen along the Hudson River in the early 90s. That's the period of time when this was. It was 1991. And then I found an article that some hunters in the area where I live had encountered that thing too. And I was not alone at the time, but I thought I was. But I just learned to, over time, you are able to embed it in the fabric of who you are consciously. And later on, I've been able to bring it out, because I have people to talk to, like you and Bob. I've been able to share it with people, and it didn't stop there. Some things happened after that too. But
Bob, correct me if you feel I'm off on this, but I had specifically asked earlier what time of day, whether it was the morning or the afternoon that the bus, encountered this phenomena above. And one might think, oh, well, that's why the 4 other young kids were dozing off, get up early for school. No, they weren't meant to see this or experience it any more than the partner of somebody who has had lifelong abduction experiences wakes up when the room fills with light and their partner is floated through a window, that this is part of a very specific pattern of individuals turned off. And on that note, we have had a missing time experience because our first hour is just blown by.
Already? Wow. It seemed as though even the bus driver seemed to be asleep during that encounter. It was, the whole thing was like a still shot almost.
Peter Robbins here with my very special guest, Jamison Bollinger, Robert Long. Stay with us. Back in 3.5 minutes.
Are we alone in the universe? The most important question facing humanity is on the verge of being settled once and for all. The Mutual UFO Network has been at the forefront of this journey for nearly 50 years. Our members worldwide are dedicated to the research, documentation, and awareness that will shape the future of humanity. Won't you join us?
Peter Robbins back here with my special guest tonight, Jamie Bollinger and Robert Long, Bob, to his friends. And Bob, I'm going to take a moment here and read into the record, so to say, a liner note from your and Jim Bauck's absolutely terrific book. And again, I stress here that you cover material that no one else has hyper-focused on. The book again is called Alien Abduction, The Control Factor by James Bauck, B-O-U-C-K, and Robert Long, available on Amazon and from fine booksellers anywhere. Alien Abduction. Imagine getting into your car and driving to a place you know, but for some reason you end up at an unintended location. You see nothing, you see something unusual. Then you forget all about it. An hour or so passes, and now you don't remember any of it. That's a control factor in abduction cases that allows aliens to abduct any human or control any non-human object from any location in the world without human permission or knowledge for purposes unknown. Then victims are returned to Earth without memory of the experience. Discover what science is learning about the alien presence and the way they manipulate and why aliens are here. Find out why some can see UFOs and some can't. What a typical abduction scenario is like, and what you can do to prevent being taken. A foreword to this book is provided by one of the best informed scholars in this entire field, and that's our dear friend Kathleen Marden, niece of Betty and Barney Hill, the first modern recorded abductees. We haven't touched on, and we're not even sure whether there is an abduction experience here as opposed to attempts at or that profile of people who interface. But again, the control factor, that how can we not acknowledge something like this when it happens and tell everybody in the world that we know? I think part of that, and we're now in what I would call an age of post-ridicule to a greater degree, is the fact that early on, from the get-go, really, the beginning of the modern age of UFOs, so to say, Western culture was hardwired into the understanding that it's shorthand for saying, I'm delusional, I'm a little crazy, flying saucers and little green men, etc. Bob, your thoughts is kind of, again, the control factor and some of what Jamie's been saying here and his behavior in terms of not getting out there in the world and talking about it all these years.
Well, first off, part of the control, if that is indeed what he is experiencing, is generally to encourage the individual to even not remember it, much less talk about it. It's you see people that have gone through regression, and they're told by these entities that they are not to tell anyone about it, that it's a secret, that they're on a mission. When you're over the years, everybody feels like they're the only one. They feel like they're by themselves, and that was my first thing that I tried to tell everyone: is you're not the only one. You're not by yourself. You know, there's a whole big group of people that have shared experiences like this. Rather, it was a peripheral experience where you've seen things, but you never had, any direct contact, which does happen. And, other people who have had years and years of experiences, never remembered a single thing. But they may have certain odd occurrences, like, they drive to some place that they're familiar with, but they end up somewhere else and they have missing time, and they just forget about it. Go home, go to bed. It wasn't important, and maybe it wasn't important, but it's also what makes this such a hard thing to investigate. The best thing you can do when someone wants to know about their experience is ask them questions pertaining to their senses when things like this happen. Because your senses will tell you more about what's going on than your brain will, because you look up and there's a UFO above your head. You tend to go to not up to 10, but some past 11 and freaking out. But it's something that everybody that has any type of an experience goes through, and once you hook them up to other people, once you have groups that get together and share their experiences, you find people grow immensely. You find people gain strength immensely. I know at the MUFON symposiums, there's always a couple rooms of people after hours that are full of people that have had all kinds of experiences, and I've been very fortunate to be invited to those, and it's some of the like I said, some of the best people I've ever met, just outstanding individuals. Now, I got a question for you, Jamie.
Okay.
Something that I've noticed over the years is many people who have unusual experiences also have some type of, I really hate to use the term sixth sense or special gifts where they have premonitions, where they, stuff like that. Have you ever had any inklings like that? You knew something was going to happen before it did, or
No, no, I don't think I've ever had anything. Well, actually, I take that back. There was a period where this may be totally irrelevant to my experience, but after that happened, there was a period of time where my best friend, his name was Waylon, could take a deck of cards, and you can't see through the deck of cards, but he could shuffle them. I could stare at the back of that card long enough and tell him what suit of cards that is, and it would show up like a greenish glow. That was something that I had not paired with my experience up until maybe 3 years ago. That had happened, and I that may be totally irrelevant, but that's the one thing that I would have, and that didn't last. That was just a more of like an entertainment thing that we discovered. It freaked us both out. It was at my birthday party. It was right after that, but like I say, that wasn't something that I was able to use. Really didn't even try to use it later on, and haven't since really.
okay.
But, anything profound? No, I don't think there's been anything like that.
Just like UFOs, experiences like that go into the extra perception tend to be something that is poo-pooed and ignored, just like UFOs. And but the one thing that a common thing that I've seen is people that have special gifts like that. It doesn't mean that they're an abductee or that they're going to have experiences. However, on the other end of the spectrum, everybody who does have these experiences is also gifted in some way, and it has to do. I think it is related to the experience itself, because you're hardwired differently, and it either allows them to contact you or put voices in your head, or make you feel things differently than a person that isn't that sensitive won't, that they can't do. So, but it's run the gamut over the years. Everyone I've worked with that has had any type of a real serious experience is also very gifted in some way, whether they like it or not. They've had types of experiences or sensitivities, or they're very empathic. They share clairvoyance. It's very, very common in my experience.
I'm going to jump in here and bring up something that bears on the whole UFO question and people in law enforcement. In the late 1960s, the so-called University of Colorado Condon Commission, which was a very unspontaneous or it was a rigged, to use the term, a rigged study of the UFO phenomena, geared specifically to be able to dismiss it, so that the Air Force, which had been saddled with the question, I think from 1947 on, remember, the Air Force began in September of 1947, a scant matter of months after the summer when Kenneth Arnold had his sightings and the Roswell incident happened. I think in great part because they happened to be stuck with the name the Air Force, although the naval intelligence was very deeply involved from the get-go. But it was used as an opportunity for the Air Force to officially get out of the UFO investigation business, which of course they did not. They just went covert with it. An interesting thing happened, though, starting in about 1969, which the general public, who, when an individual, as often as not in very good standing in their community, a person worthy of respect, and certainly nobody who was looking for attention from seeing a flying saucer or whatever you want to call it, would report such an event. It would be reported to the local Air Force base or to the Pentagon and the Air Force in Washington, D.C. And very suddenly, there was no one, no agency, no authority given over to report it to. And that is when local police forces around the United States started receiving more and more reports. Often, the reports came in, small towns and large, big cities and small, but in most of America, serving police officers in their communities often knew many of the people that they served. They were their neighbors, they grew up with them, and they were the ones saddled with this question. It's still quite the way it is, although it may have changed somewhat in the past few years. But my first question is, in your service in the police departments that you worked in, were you ever privy to any reports coming in or any brother or sister officers bringing up this subject, either their own experience or a report from somebody that they had received?
Yes. In fact, one of my fellow officers he experienced, I'm going to call it an orb. Within the same week that I did, I was working a peak shift where you work from like midnight until noon the next day. And I was going in to work right around 11:30, I think it was. And I was driving this old beater Honda, and I was changing gears and just having a good time driving to work, relaxing. It's the middle of the night. Most people were in bed. And I pull up to a stop sign. This is out in the country. And I look up and there's the most beautiful cobalt blue ball of light hanging there in the sky. It wasn't moving. And I pulled over because I thought, well, that's a really powerful light. I'm like, what kind of craft is this? I thought maybe a police aircraft or a helicopter. So I got out to see what was going on. It never moved, completely silent. And it was probably 10 miles from Sharon Harris Nuclear Facility is where we were located, where I was located at the time. I remember that same week, one of my fellow officers saw that and put a message out on Facebook asking if anyone else in the area had seen it, that they know what in the world it is. It was moving when he saw it. But that's the only time that ever really came into play in my law enforcement career. Not to say there wasn't a mention here and there of oddities and things like that, but as far as in the vein of what we're talking about, that's the one time that I remember it did happen. It was in the same area, same week, and it was near the nuclear facility.
Was it cobalt blue, the one he saw?
It was.
Interesting.
It was.
And let me follow up on Bob's question in the first hour when you were talking about that blue, that particular color blue.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but would you characterize it? Maybe you've never seen an arc welder, but that kind of blue, that
Yes,
arc welder's blue. Okay.
that's what it reminded me of, actually. Yeah.
Well, that it almost has become shorthand. I have heard people on and off for decades. That's the word that they found. That's the term that they found for that particular blue that they've seen. So you're certainly not alone. Several thoughts occur to me at the same time. One is, in the narrow area that we're talking about right now, in terms of UFO phenomena, and I say UFO as opposed to UAP, the more contemporary term, unidentified aerial phenomena, which I have mixed feelings about. It's some people feel a change was due in the terminology to modernize it and bring it into our modern age, the same way that in 1956, the term in use, primarily flying saucer, was transposed to unidentified flying object, less sensationalistic, more scientific. But what we're talking about here is not unidentified aerial phenomena. We're talking very specifically about unidentified objects,
Correct.
machines under intelligent control, obviously far advanced technology, coming and going with impunity, and the intelligences behind them not revealing why they're there. This may sound so obvious, but I remember years ago in talking about what we're talking about now with David Jacobs, he brought up something that I knew about working with Bud Hopkins and being privy to not dozens, but some several hundred accounts over the years where I was meeting these people and often hearing their descriptions and occasionally witnessing an hypnotic regression, either at Bud's request with the individual's permission, of course, or occasionally the individual's request with Bud's okay, of course. And what David said to me was so simple, but I'll never forget it. It was, I want you to imagine that there are locations out there, you know, on a planet, underground area, on some asteroid and some cavern that's been turned into a factory, so to say, where these machines are manufactured. And what predicated what David was talking about was particular and specific similarities in the metal tables that people described that they were examined on. That, as far as I know, nobody in the work has ever discussed in detail, which is a good thing, because it's just one more thing, the details in question, that can be used to corroborate to some degree this. And he said, I want you to imagine or understand that somewhere in that manufacturing complex is an assembly line or an area where they manufacture those tables. I can't really explain it except to say in that moment I thought to myself, oh my God, of course. And I never thought about that before. But, you know, we've all seen pictures, not just of the old Model T Ford assembly lines where Ford himself changed the history of manufacturing and the economy of the Western world by hiring guys at $5 a day, huge salaries at the time, to do this repetitive work. And now, you know, when we were kids, we might have thought of it as science fiction, but a good deal of it is done by robots. And there are locations somewhere out there where they make these things. And I don't know why it struck me so profoundly, but it did. And to think about, again, we're stuck in our own human world and we do our best to, think big on these things. But imagine, like during World War II, being at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where they're manufacturing a battleship, this huge thing. You've got all these guys on scaffolds and women working away, fabricating these things, steel coming in from the plants in Pittsburgh, still warm to the touch, that they're using to make these things. Where in the name of God, and what the hell is it like in the area where they manufacture the craft that you saw above that school bus? I mean, it's such a 60s phrase, but that blows my mind.
I've had that very thought. I just wish that I could see where it came from.
In that spirit, I hope I never lose that sensibility, that this becomes mundane, or just because I've done this work for over 40 years, that I'm blasé about it. And I have to tell you both, I would say on the average, once, twice a year, big time. And it can be predicated on, I don't know, part of an account of somebody or just a reflection on what we're talking about here, that I find myself going, my God, this is really happening. This is really happening. This is not some sophisticated psychological aberration informed by this condition called sleep paralysis and overactive imaginations and blah, blah, blah. This is effing happening. Oh, yeah. And I hope I never lose that sensibility. Bob and I and colleagues talk about cases. It's a wonderfully dispassionate word to substitute for the experience of human beings often having, and it's not always negative, their most profound, life-changing, paradigm-shifting events of their entire lives.
A good way to put it.
That's right.
And especially those of us in the work never should lose contact with that. If we do, maybe we're in the wrong area of the work. And I'll digress even a moment more and say there are so many areas of research within the greater field of UFO studies, just like there are in so many other areas of study, whether it's history or the sciences. You can specialize in 50 different things. There are some of us who are just pretty good with people. I think the three of us qualify in that area. We care about people, and we're comfortable talking about uncomfortable things, and we're good listeners. There are people that are not so good in that area, who are wonderful about working in archives or going through minutia and paperwork. Other people who are great out in the field, anomalous material being organic material being gathered for scientific testing. And we have to find our own niche in the work. Or as experiencers, folks need to be clear with themselves and not have any awkwardness around it or guilt, that I'm just fine not talking about this to anybody forever. I can live with that. Or I can share this with such and such because I know they love me and they're there for me and they're strong. And I just intuitively know that they'll be okay with this, even if it's awkward. Or I can, at a certain point, talk to somebody I don't know about this. Or at a certain point, I can speak about this in a public forum with people listening who I don't know at all. I think that takes great courage. And it's also terribly important, because for every Jamie Bollinger who decides at a certain point, because he's comfortable enough with it, in part because he has two friends that he can lean on this, or not even that, but just be in a forum with. There are people, make no mistake about it, that are watching or listening right now, and a good number more who will be watching and listening to the things that we say tonight, a week, a month, a year, or however far in the future, that this will be of real value to, in helping them take the next step, or know they've taken all the steps they want to take. So,
exactly. I'm hoping that what I've shared can, if nothing else, help someone find the courage, or to realize they're not alone, the way I felt alone when it first happened.
Yeah.
And
we are all in this together, to put it mildly. And again, you and I, Jamie, were back and forth before the show, and I guess I've done about 180 broadcasts or so, closer to 200 over the past more than 3 years. And I'm pretty comfortable doing it at this point. Leading into it, I probably did several hundred interviews as an investigative writer and researcher. But I try to, keep putting myself in the place of my guests wherever possible, and understand that this is kind of a foreign experience for some people and can make you a bit nervous. This is not a podcast. If something screws up, it goes out live all over the world at the same moment. And I do joke occasionally, and my dear producer is watching from the wings now and controlling the technical aspects, Race Hobbs, and I have shared a number of wonderful moments on live radio where things don't go the way you wanted to. I could do a podcast, but I prefer doing it this way. And in part because I want people who watch and listen to the shows that I do to have that feeling. This is no more under control than the things we're talking about.
That's right.
And so what you and I were talking about, Jamie, before the show, was that you were feeling a little nervous about this. Mm-hmm. And I would have laughed out loud in your face, because you make a good part of your living running into burning buildings. And save your being nervous for that.
I actually do it for free. I'm volunteers.
Well, there you go.
It seems like there's something fundamentally wrong with that, but I love to do it.
Well, all I can say is we people in the world are very thankful that there are people like you to keep our homes from burning down at the moments when something terrible happens, because we don't share that particular trait with you.
Well, the best part of it, and I can say that I have one of my sons, he's a firefighter with me as well, volunteer. One of the best parts, if not the best part, is being able to salvage something for someone, or being there. We don't want something bad to happen. We don't want someone's house to catch fire, but we want to be there for them when it does, minimize damage and show some support. And I feel like that should always be our message. That should always be our goal, is to show kindness to people.
I never heard it put like that. And you said something in the first hour that I reacted to and resonated. I'm wondering if Bob feels the same. When you're a little boy growing up in America, certainly when I was a kid, and you begin to get a sense that you're going to become an adult like your parents at some level, and that you're going to do grown-up things. My generation, a soldier, a police officer, a fireman. I chose not to go into the military given the time that I was service eligible. And I didn't go into law enforcement, obviously. But that 4-year-old that had the toy pedal fire truck and the hat and understood that these people showed great courage and were important to all of us. Most of us that had that feeling as kids didn't become firefighters, but thankfully some of us did. And what you just said made me realize we're talking apples and oranges here, and I don't mean in any way to compare what firefighters do to what Bob and I do, but we hope that people don't go through these experiences, or if they do, that they're not traumatized by them. And if they do, and they need somebody to talk to, that we're here for that. We actually have about 25 minutes or so left. And I want to take several minutes to tell you guys a story, and our listeners too. I don't think I've ever told this, certainly not broadcast. I have told several individuals about it. This would have been about 2018 or 19. I think 19. It was, I think, the year before the pandemic hit. And I had given a talk in just outside of Philadelphia for a group that I had spoken to at other times. And my dear friend and colleague Jennifer Stein ran this group. They're still in effect. I think it's called Mainline MUFON. Mainline, the term coming from the main railway line that fed into Philadelphia when the railroads were new. And I've spoken at regional, and local events as well as national ones for many years, and particular affection for speaking at libraries. And this is a situation where we always used the library, had a great agreement with them, a room that seated about 50 or 60 people comfortably. And as is sometimes the case, and Bob, I know you're familiar with this, even though you visually dropped out for the month and you're back, that often, after you give a talk, your sponsor and often anybody that wants to go out with you guys will go out to a luncheonette or, a restaurant in the area and have dinner together. And it's nice. I always like that. And, you hang out and you get to just chat into the evening. This group of MUFON group always went to the same place, your classic Greek diner, with a menu as big as the New York City phone book when they used to have phone books. And, to be honest, I used to like the fact that I could order whatever I wanted and have a drink or two and, hang out and talk. And I was the guy of the hour, it's a tiny little ego boost, meet new friends, hang out with acquaintances. And I got there late enough that there was only like one seat open, and it was one very long table, and it was kind of off to the side, and I didn't really know anybody at that part of the table, as opposed to the other part of the table where the people I knew and would have felt more comfortable with. And I sit down, and directly opposite me is a gentleman, a certain American archetype. I'm guessing he was well in his 70s and could have been older. I'm not great at guessing ethnicities, but there were things about his face that made me feel he was at least partly of Irish descent. He looked like he had been like a worker all his life. He had on some kind of ball cap, dressed in old clothes. I relate this to you, remembering how humbling it was later, because I judged him. Just, some older guy that's going to be kind of boring, and I'm stuck here looking at you for dinner. And, all right. And he didn't introduce himself by name, but he said, I found your talk really interesting. Thank you. And then he started to tell me a story, which at first I thought, oh boy, some old guy telling me a story. Until I realized I needed to listen, and listen very carefully. He said, I spent my life as a beat cop in Philadelphia when I was a young cop, and he related an experience to me where he had to use his firearm early on in his career. A guy was acting crazy, sticking a loaded shotgun out the window. He didn't have any idea of the backstory, which was the poor guy had really been through something awful. But as he went up the stairs, that rifle, that barrel swung around, a double-barreled shotgun, and he had to fire. The guy lived, but he was wounded, and it was a terrible experience for my dinner companion as a young police officer. And I said something like, "Oh wow, that's really terrible." And what he did essentially was say, "No, that's not what I'm talking about here. Just listen." Okay. He said, sometime after that, I got a call that a building in my beat area, and it was old-fashioned walking the beat, was on fire, and I made my way there double time. I was the first officer to arrive. There were no firefighters yet. There was a woman outside of the house, and she was still in her pajamas, and she was screaming that she had 2 children, young children, in the house. And I just, I ran in, and everything was on fire. She said it's the bedroom in the back. And I just made my way through, and I got to the room, and there was a little boy, about 7 or so, a girl about 5, and I grabbed the girl, and I ran out. The firefighters had just arrived. I gave them this child, and I ran back in. I got the boy. I came out. My clothing was singed, and I had some burns I wasn't even aware of, and both children were taken to the hospital. At this point, you can imagine I am 110% there with what he's saying. Everybody else has gone away. I had no sense that anybody else was around. I'm just listening to everything he's saying. And I think I responded with something like, wow, that was so courageous. He said, no, listen. He said, I learned shortly after that the little girl expired on the way to the hospital. And the boy made it to the hospital alive, but they were not able to resuscitate him. He died as well. Quiet. He said, I remember very specifically that the boy was wearing pajamas that were maroon in color with blue piping. And not surprisingly, I never forgot about this. The years pass. It's now quite a few years later. I've advanced a rank or two, but I'm still a beat cop in uniform, and that's what I did for 30 years, or however many years I was in the service. And I'm having lunch in a luncheonette, taking my break. place I ate at sometimes and looking around. And I look across the restaurant and there's a family there. Obviously, mother, father, son, daughter. And I noticed that the kid's looking at me. You know, little boys, police officer in uniform. He said, I could hardly believe it, but it was, this little boy didn't look something like the boy I got out of that fire. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but it looked exactly like the boy that I got out of that fire. And he wasn't taking his eyes off me. He was just absolutely fixed on me. I began to feel very uncomfortable very quickly, in great part because I immediately noticed he was wearing a t-shirt that was maroon with blue piping on the sleeves. All I could think of was, I've got to get out of here. I don't remember him telling me he finished his lunch, but he just got up, put money on the table, and started to walk to the door. And as he stood up, the little boy stood up and immediately started to walk in a direction to head him off. He looked at the parents. It was one of those moments, as a cop, you're observant. Their look said to me, oh, look, you know, our son wants to go meet a police officer, a nice smile. He said, I couldn't move fast enough. He blocked my way. And I looked down at him, and he looked up at me. I couldn't say anything, but he said, and I remember this, quote unquote, "You recognized me, didn't you?" I don't really remember anything else about the rest of the evening, except that I'll never forget it. And in this work, you learn one way or another that nothing is quite the way it seems. And that this thing called life that we're making our way through, the overt parts, the parts that are the most real, family, friends, career, historical events. Sometimes it seems a little like a stage set, that it's all managed in some way. And that it's like some kind of theater, that whatever we believe, that's fine. But in this life, belief often doesn't count for much. It helps us, through the day, or to find comfort and peace and security and some stability in life. The whole UFO phenomena, to a degree, questions these notions. But this abduction part of impossible things happening, completely impossible, voices in your head, presences that shouldn't be there, for people that have the full experiences being floated through huge, solid objects, windows, walls, what have you, roofs, looking up and seeing something that shouldn't be able to sustain itself in the sky without falling right out of the sky because it's so heavy. As a kid, I remember learning the basics of the idea of ships that were made out of metal, and you put metal in water and it goes right down to the bottom. But this displacement that, given certain rules, things float. I'm not even sure where I'm going with this. It's just, I guess, that combination, Jamie, of the fact that you're a firefighter, you served in law enforcement, you've had what we can certainly call, in the field, paranormal experiences. I just felt it was time that I shared that story with you all. Jamie, have you had any of these experiences or anything like the experiences that you had when you were younger in the past few years?
Not so much so like it was then. Going back to when the cobalt blue orb that I mentioned earlier, that was actually in the year 2010. That next year to year and a half was very active around the house. My significant other at the time and I started experiencing more of those orbs, but they were not the same color. My oldest son, who he is now a police officer, he came from the Marine Corps and now is starting out his career as a police officer. At the time, he was only 12, and it scared him to death because he saw it right outside the house.
Oof.
He took it happened to him one time when I wasn't home. He took pictures, and he has on his little older slide phone a picture of 3 of those things. They weren't right at the house, but they were close enough by that everybody saw it in the neighborhood. So there have been things like that happen. Very overpowering feelings when I'm around someone, sometimes of familiarity, even though I've never met that person before. But more than anything else, a longing to understand what I don't understand yet. What's beyond, and what are we supposed to be doing?
The big question. Bob, I know, like me, you're not a ghost hunter or a freelance paranormalist, but our work does put us every once in a while into another area of non-standard behavior, activity. That account that I just shared, have you ever had anything even remotely like that, something that absolutely jarred you? And, you're hearing it from, and I should say here, in no way do I feel there's even the slightest chance that this man was trying to impress me, or was making something up, or had, created some fake background, or, gee, I think I'll, see how this guy reacts to this tall tale. I'd bet a lot of money on it. It just wasn't possible. Anything for you that sticks in your memory of being taken into another realm of this strange veil that we call our lives in doing the work?
Nothing in that particular nature. I've had personal sightings of UFOs over the years that always kind of freaked me out a little bit. But as far as the paranormal, I always tried to. I guess I always had a slight uncomfortable feeling with the paranormal. It wasn't anything that I could, hold in my hand, so to speak. So I always kind of avoided it. And it wasn't until I started working with people that were having that it started coming up in the questioning as a frequent gift that so many people had, and it seemed to go hand in hand. We'll probably find in the long run a lot of these paranormal experiences are linked pretty close, either because you're wired differently, better, whatever the case may be, you're more perceptive. Just some insects and animals can see different wavelengths of light than we do.
Yes,
they see
good parallel.
Different way, and the people who are gifted sometimes feel things in a different way, or they sense things in a different way. Jamie mentioned that every once in a while he'll feel a connection with someone that he doesn't know, and that's very common with someone who shares some of these unique experiences. It could be just because you're wired on the same frequency that they are. It's I know I saw an example once of frequency. A guy had a tuning fork set up on a mount with a rubber ball leaning against it, dangling from a string, and he took another tuning fork and he banged it, but it was a different frequency than the tuning fork that was mounted, and nothing happened. And then he took a tuning fork that was the same exact frequency as the one that was mounted with the ball leaning against it on a string, and he hit that, and the one that was mounted instantly started vibrating and bouncing that ball. And I think the people who are gifted share frequencies like that, and that's why they're perceptive with each other, even though they don't know each other.
Well observed.
That makes perfect sense to me. Never heard it put like that, but that really resonates. That really.
Jamie, we've talked, of course, before on and off over the past years, but this brought us all certainly closer. You are part of a very large fraternity. I don't know about Bob, but I almost shudder sometimes when I try to give it a statistic. I think the things that you have had happen to you and that Bob and I have documented and so many other people are so much more prevalent among the general population than we're certainly comfortable with. But I think it's fair to say, at the least, that every one of us, everyone listening, everyone watching, now and in the future, unless you live, on an island or under a rock or are a total hermit, every one of us knows an individual or individuals who have had these things happen and either maintain them as the center of their secret life for all the reasons we can understand, or share them very discreetly with somebody or a small circle of people that we are not included in, but that the fact that we're not aware of it does not indicate that it isn't going on. And perhaps this period of time that we're in now, that began in December of 2017, where the tone changed. The endemic ridicule, always associated and really well played by the government and the general media,